It was a quiet evening in the small town of Arizona. Christina, a 19-year-old college student, was home alone. Her parents had gone out of town for the weekend, and she decided to use this opportunity to catch up on her studies and enjoy some peace and quiet. Little did she know, her night was about to take a horrifying turn. Around 10 p.m., Christina was in her bedroom, finishing up an essay for her psychology class. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. She found solace in the stillness, the only company being the soft hum of her desk lamp. As she typed away, she suddenly heard a faint noise coming from downstairs. It sounded like a door creaking open. Christina paused, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. She listened intently, convincing herself that it was probably just the wind or the house settling. But then she heard it again, louder this time. Her heart began to race. She slowly stood up and crept towards her bedroom door. Peeking out into the hallway, she saw nothing out of the ordinary. Determined to prove to herself that it was nothing, Christina decided to investigate. She tiptoed down the stairs, her eyes scanning the darkness. As she reached the bottom, she saw the front door slightly ajar. Panic surged through her veins. She knew she had locked it earlier. Just as she was about to close the door, she heard footsteps behind her. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing in the shadows of the living room, was a tall, menacing figure. His eyes glinted with a sinister light, and a twisted smile spread across his face. Christina's mind went blank with terror. She bolted towards the nearest room, the washroom, slamming the door shut behind her. She locked it quickly and backed away, her hands trembling. She could hear the intruder's footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. Desperately, she tried to stifle her sobs, pressing her hands over her mouth. The doorknob rattled, and the intruder began to pound on the door. "Come out, little girl," he taunted, his voice dripping with malice. Christina's heart was pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. She glanced around the small washroom, looking for anything she could use to defend herself. Outside, the pounding grew more intense, and then suddenly it stopped. Silence filled the air, but Christina knew better than to assume he had left. She stayed perfectly still, straining to hear any sign of movement. Minutes felt like hours, and just as she began to relax, the door burst open with a deafening crash. Christina screamed and darted past the intruder, her adrenaline fueling her escape. She ran through the house, tears streaming down her face. She could hear him laughing behind her, a sound that would haunt her nightmares for years to come. She made it to the front door, flung it open, and sprinted into the night. She ran helplessly, her feet barely touching the ground as she fled down the dark, empty streets. She didn't stop until she reached the nearest neighbor's house, banging frantically on the door. The neighbor, a kind elderly woman, let her in and called the police. The police arrived quickly, but the intruder was nowhere to be found. They searched the house and the surrounding area, but came up empty-handed. Christina was left shaken and terrified, knowing that the man who had invaded her home was still out there. The days turned into weeks, and life slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after such a traumatic event. Christina couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every creak of the house, every shadow seemed to hold a threat. One night, weeks after the initial incident, Christina was asleep in her bed when she felt a presence in her room. Her eyes snapped open, and she saw the intruder standing over her. Before she could scream, he clamped a hand over her mouth and whispered, "Did you miss me?" Christina struggled, but he was too strong. He dragged her out of bed and carried her to his car, parked just outside her window. He threw her into the back seat, tying her hands and feet with rough, coarse rope. She could see the madness in his eyes, the pleasure he took in her fear. The car sped off into the night, taking her far from the safety of her home. He took her to an abandoned cabin in the woods where he kept her captive. Days turned into a blur of terror and pain. He enjoyed watching her suffer, taking pleasure in her screams and tears. As the days went by, the intruder would talk to Christina, revealing the twisted depths of his mind. He told her how he hated beautiful women because they reminded him of his mother, who had abandoned him as a child. His voice would take on a sickly sweet tone as he described his mother's cruelty and his desire to make all beautiful women suffer as he had. "You think you're so special, don't you?" he would sneer, pacing the small cabin. "All you beautiful women, always thinking you're better than everyone else. My mother was like that. She left me to rot, and now you'll pay for her sins." He kept Christina tied to a wooden chair, her wrists and ankles bound tightly with rope. The cabin was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small, flickering candle on a rickety table. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. Christina's body ached from the constant strain of being tied up, and her mind was in a perpetual state of fear and despair. Despite the terror, Christina knew she had to escape. She carefully observed her surroundings, looking for any opportunity to free herself. She noticed a sharp piece of metal sticking out from one of the cabin's wooden beams. It was within reach, but she had to wait for the right moment when the intruder wasn't around. One night, while the intruder was out in the forest, Christina seized her chance. She scooted the chair closer to the beam, her heart pounding in her chest. She began to rub the ropes against the metal, feeling them gradually fray. After what felt like hours, the ropes finally snapped. Christina quickly untied her ankles, her hands shaking with urgency. She crept out of the cabin, each step cautious and deliberate. The forest was dark and eerie, the only light coming from the moon above. She moved as quietly as she could, every twig snapping underfoot making her wince. She knew he was out there somewhere, but she had no choice but to risk it. As she made her way through the dense trees, she heard a rustling behind her. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The intruder was close. She could hear his footsteps, his voice calling out for her. She began to run, her fear giving her speed. She ran blindly, her only goal to get as far away as possible. Just when she thought she couldn't run any longer, she stumbled onto a dirt road. She saw headlights approaching and waved frantically. The car screeched to a halt, and a middle-aged man stepped out, looking alarmed. "Help me, please," Christina cried, her voice hoarse from screaming. The man didn't hesitate. He ushered her into the car and sped off, leaving the intruder behind. Christina looked back and saw him standing at the edge of the road, a look of pure rage on his face. The man drove her to the nearest police station, where she was finally safe. The police launched a massive search for the intruder, but once again, he vanished without a trace. Christina was left with the scars of her ordeal, but she was alive. This terrifying tale serves as a reminder of the dangers that lurk in the shadows. Christina's story is one of survival against unimaginable odds. Thank you for joining me in this chilling journey. If you enjoyed this suspenseful tale, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more gripping stories like this. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Remember to stay safe and vigilant, because you never know what might be lurking in the darkness. Until next time, sweet dreams. Or should I say, nightmares.